It was a quiet, ordinary afternoon when everything changed. The kind of day where the sun poured in through the window, casting soft beams of light across the living room, making it feel warm and cozy. I had always loved this time of day. It was when the house felt at its most peaceful. The gentle hum of life outside, the laughter of children playing, and the contented silence of a house at rest. My heart swelled with love for my family, my grandson, Tom, and my son and daughter-in-law who lived just down the hall. I was sitting in my favorite chair, a worn armchair by the window, a cup of tea in my hands, trying to enjoy the little moment of peace that seemed to have eluded me for weeks. Tom, who was about 10, was playing in the other room, his toys scattered across the floor in what I had come to accept as his organized chaos. He was a good boy, or at least he had been. His mischievous smile and boundless energy were infectious, but lately I had started to notice a change. He wasn't as obedient as he used to be, his once sweet nature turning into a more reckless, defiant one. But I didn't think too much of it. He was just a child, after all. As I sat there, lost in my thoughts, Tom suddenly appeared in the doorway. He was holding a steaming mug in his hands, his face lit up with a grin I had come to recognize as the mischievous one. I smiled, thinking he was bringing me a drink, something he often did when he wanted to show off his helpful side. But before I could say anything, his actions took me completely by surprise. With no warning, Tom hurled the hot water at me. My body tensed, and in that split second, the mug hit me with a searing force. The hot liquid splashed across my arms, searing into my skin. Pain surged through my body, and I cried out in shock and agony. The shock of it was overwhelming. How could he do that? How could my own flesh and blood throw boiling water on me without a second thought? I stood up, my hands instinctively going to my arms, feeling the heat radiating from the burns. But the pain from the burns was nothing compared to the hurt that bloomed in my chest. Tom stood there, frozen for a moment, staring at me. And then, as though it were nothing more than a game, he laughed. The sound of his laughter echoed in my ears, and I felt my heart sink deeper with each passing second. "Grandma, you're fine," he said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. He didn't even look sorry. In fact, his eyes twinkled, with a kind of excitement that made my blood run cold. I couldn't understand it. I had always been there for him. I had cared for him when he was sick, hugged him when he was upset, and been a constant presence in his life. How could he do something like this to me? Was this the child I had watched grow up? The boy I had loved with all my heart? The pain in my arms felt secondary to the emotional hurt I felt in my chest. It was a betrayal that I wasn't sure I could come back from. The shock of it all made my body freeze. I couldn't move. I couldn't even speak. But what came next was even worse than the burn on my skin. His parents, my son and daughter-in-law, walked into the room, seemingly unaware of the gravity of the situation. They looked at me, standing there in pain, my hands clutching my arms, and then they turned to Tom. "Tom, what did you do?" my son asked, his voice calm, almost dismissive. "He's just a kid," my daughter-in-law chimed in, brushing the incident aside as if it were nothing more than a small accident. "He didn't mean it." But I did mean it, didn't I? I had been the one who had been hurt, the one who had suffered in silence, and yet all I received was a trivialization of my pain. I felt my heart grow cold, and a bitter lump rose in my throat. They weren't taking this seriously. They were treating it as though it were nothing more than a harmless mistake. A child being a child. I looked at them, searching for some sign of empathy, some sign that they understood the gravity of the situation. But there was none. "It's just water," my son said with a shrug, dismissing it entirely. "He's just playing around." But I wasn't playing. This wasn't a game. The pain in my arms was real, but the betrayal I felt, the abandonment of my dignity, was far more painful. They hadn't seen it, hadn't understood it. They didn't see how deeply I had been hurt. I turned away from them, feeling the walls of the house closing in on me. I couldn't stay here, in a place where my pain was invisible to those I loved. They hadn't just ignored my physical pain. They had ignored my worth, my feelings. And in that moment, I knew that something had to change. I couldn't let this go. I gathered my strength, pushing aside the overwhelming wave of hurt, and made the decision to leave. I wouldn't stay in a house that no longer felt like home, where my love and sacrifice were so easily dismissed. It wasn't just about the burn on my skin. It was about my heart breaking, piece by piece, in front of people who should have cared enough to see it. The pain from the burn on my arms wasn't just physical. It was deep, emotional, and overwhelming. As the water had splashed across my skin, I felt the heat sear into me, but it was the coldness that followed that hurt the most. I couldn't understand how things had gone so wrong. It wasn't supposed to be like this. Tom was supposed to be my joy, my little ray of light, and yet here I was, standing in agony, not just from the burns, but from the betrayal of it all. I could hear Tom's laughter still echoing in my ears, and it made the pain worse. Was he not sorry at all? Did he not realize what he had done? Or was this just another one of his impulsive actions? I didn't know anymore. All I knew was that the warmth I once felt in this house, the comfort of being surrounded by my family, had vanished, replaced by a cold, suffocating emptiness. I looked around, trying to make sense of it all. My son and daughter-in-law were still standing there, so calm, so indifferent to what had just happened. They exchanged a glance, and I saw the flicker of dismissal in their eyes. It wasn't just the hot water that had burned me. It was the lack of concern from the very people who should have rushed to my aid, who should have been as devastated as I was. "She's fine, right?" My daughter-in-law's voice, though soft, carried an undertone of annoyance, as if I were making a fuss over nothing. She turned her attention to Tom, brushing off the severity of the situation. "Tom didn't mean it. He's just being a boy." "But he burned me," I wanted to shout, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I took a shaky breath and stood up, trying to mask the tremble in my legs. The tears I had held back threatened to spill over, but I couldn't let them see my weakness. I couldn't let them see how much their indifference was hurting me. My son, standing by the door, gave me a half-hearted glance and shrugged. "It's not a big deal, Mom. You'll be okay. He's just a kid. He didn't mean to hurt you." Thigh. Words stung, and I felt a wave of disbelief wash over me. Just a kid? Yes, Tom was a child, but that didn't excuse what he had done. There were boundaries. There were lines that should never be crossed, no matter how old someone was. And the way they were treating it, brushing it off as though it were a minor mistake, made me feel invisible. I wasn't just a grandmother to them. I wasn't just a part of the family that could be overlooked when something more important came along. Yet that's how I felt. like I didn't matter, like my feelings were irrelevant. The burn on my skin was a harsh reminder of the incident, but the emotional scar was deeper. It felt like my love and care for Tom, the sacrifices I had made over the years, had all been erased in an instant. In that moment, I realized how little I meant to them. I was nothing more than a figure in the background, there when needed, invisible when not. I stood there in silence, trying to hold myself together. I didn't know what to say, and I certainly didn't know how to explain the hurt I was feeling. All I wanted was to be understood, to have someone acknowledge that this wasn't just a harmless prank. But no one did. No one even seemed to care enough to consider my feelings. As the minutes ticked by, I knew that something had shifted inside me. I couldn't stay in this house, surrounded by people who dismissed my pain. I had spent my entire life caring for them, feeding them, nurturing them, giving them everything I had. And yet in return, all I got was indifference. I had become a convenience to them, a person they could call on when needed, but whose emotions could be disregarded without a second thought. My legs felt weak as I stumbled towards the door, each step a reminder of how alone I felt in that moment. But then a thought struck me, sharp and clear. I couldn't just leave without making them understand. I couldn't just walk away without them knowing that their actions, their lack of concern, had consequences. I turned back to face them, my voice trembling with emotion. "I'm leaving," I said softly, my words thick with hurt. "I can't stay here like this. Not when I'm treated like I don't matter." There was a pause as my son and daughter-in-law exchanged uncertain glances. They didn't understand. They couldn't. In their eyes, this was nothing more than an overreaction, a trivial matter. But to me, it was everything. It was about respect. It was about love. It was about being seen, being valued, not just for what I could do for them, but for who I was. As I walked toward the door, I realized how heavy my heart had become. I had spent years loving them, sacrificing for them, but it felt like it had all been in vain. And now, I had no choice but to leave. I couldn't stay in a place where my worth was invisible, where my pain didn't matter. I paused at the door, looking back one last time. Tom was still standing there, his face unreadable. But there was something in his eyes, a flicker of confusion, maybe even guilt. But it was too late now. I couldn't undo what had happened. I couldn't undo the way they had made me feel. I had to leave, for my own peace of mind, for my own dignity. With one final glance, I stepped out of the door, the weight of my decision heavy in my chest. But I knew, deep down, it was the right thing to do. The door closed behind me with a soft click, but the sound echoed in my heart like a deafening crash. I stood outside for a moment, letting the cool air wash over me, trying to steady my breath. The world around me seemed unchanged. The sky was the same shade of soft blue. The birds still chirped in the trees, and the distant hum of life carried on as if nothing had happened. But for me, everything had shifted. My family, my home, everything I had known was suddenly different. It wasn't just the physical pain from the burn on my arms. It was the deeper wound, the one that would take far longer to heal. The betrayal, the dismissal of my suffering, that was the true scar that I carried with me. I wasn't sure where to go. I wasn't sure of anything anymore. I had spent years caring for Tom, for my son and daughter-in-law, but now, as I stood alone on the sidewalk, I felt like a stranger in my own life. The sense of abandonment, of being discarded as if I were no longer important, weighed on me heavily. I had given everything for them. There had been so many sleepless nights spent caring for a sick child, so many days of cleaning, cooking, and running errands, all done with love and devotion. But now it seemed that all of that meant nothing. The moment I needed them most, the moment when my safety and dignity were on the line, they had ignored me. They had treated me like I was insignificant, as though I were a burden they could shrug off. It was too much. I couldn't stay in that house any longer. I didn't belong there anymore. The hardest part was not the physical pain. It was the emotional blow. I had spent years trying to teach Tom right from wrong, showing him love and patience, and yet here he was, throwing hot water at me with no remorse, as though it was nothing. My heart broke for him, for the boy I had watched grow into someone who could hurt others without understanding the consequences. And it wasn't just his actions that troubled me. It was the lack of concern from his parents. They were supposed to protect me, to stand up for me when I was in pain, but instead, they dismissed it as though it were no big deal. "He's just a kid," they said. But what did that mean for me? Was I to be treated like this for the rest of my life, brushed aside when it was convenient, expected to just forgive and forget without ever being heard? I didn't know what I was expecting when I left. Part of me hoped they would come after me, that they would see the gravity of what had happened. But the longer I stood there, the more I realized that they might never understand. They had already shown me that they didn't care enough to see the hurt I was feeling. How could I go back to that? How could I return to a place where my worth was invisible, where my sacrifices had been taken for granted? I had to take control. I couldn't let them think this was something I would just forget. This wasn't about revenge, and it wasn't about making them suffer. It was about making them see that their actions had consequences. I needed them to understand that just because I was older, just because I was expected to be the quiet, uncomplaining grandmother didn't mean that I didn't deserve respect. I had to make them realize that what they had done, what they had allowed to happen, could not be swept under the rug. As I stood there, making my decision, a strange calm came over me. I had always been the one who put others first, always the one who sacrificed my own needs for the sake of my family. But now, it was time for me to put myself first. It was time for me to stop being the silent caretaker, the one who took everything in stride, no matter the cost. I couldn't allow them to treat me this way any longer. I walked away from their house, my mind made up. I had to leave, but I wasn't just walking away in anger or hurt. I was walking away because I had to find myself again. I had to rediscover my worth. The woman I was before all the sacrifices, the years of giving, had been lost somewhere along the way. It was time for me to find her again, to stand up for myself, to show the world that I mattered. As I walked down the street, my heart felt lighter but also heavier. It was a bittersweet feeling. I knew that my departure would change everything, that I might never be able to return to the same family dynamic again. But I couldn't stay in a place where I felt invisible. I couldn't keep living in the shadow of a love that wasn't returned. And so, I made the decision to leave. Not just the house, but the version of myself that had allowed all of this to happen. I had taken the first step toward reclaiming my life, and while it felt uncertain and painful, I knew it was the only way forward. There would be no going back now. They would have to learn, the hard way, what it meant to take someone for granted. And maybe, just maybe, they would regret it. But that was something I could no longer control. I had to let go and trust that I was doing what was right for me. It was time for me to take care of myself for once. It had been several days since I left my son's house. The physical burns from Tom's careless act were beginning to heal, but the emotional scars were far more persistent. Every night, as I lay in bed, the memories of that day replayed over and over in my mind. The laughter, the indifference from my family, and the weight of the decision I had made to leave all hung heavy in the air around me. I felt like an outsider in my own life, like I no longer belonged anywhere. My once warm and familiar world had turned cold and distant, but as the days passed, something started to shift inside me. I began to realize that leaving had been necessary, not just for my own well-being, but for the family that had treated me like an afterthought. I had always put others first, my son, my daughter-in-law, Tom. But I had never put myself first, never given myself the space to breathe, to be seen and heard. My decision to leave wasn't just a reaction to the pain. It was a step toward reclaiming my dignity. I had set boundaries, and in doing so, I had shown myself that I was worth more than the way I had been treated. But even as I started to feel stronger, a part of me couldn't escape the feeling of longing, of regret. It wasn't about the burn on my arms anymore. It was about the family I had left behind, the people I had loved with all my heart. Would they miss me? Would they understand the reasons behind my departure? Or had I simply become a distant memory to them, someone they could replace without a second thought? I spent the next few days reflecting on my relationship with Tom. He had been my joy, my little companion. I had watched him grow up, guided him through the ups and downs of childhood, and filled his life with love. To see him, my own flesh and blood, treat me with such disregard had broken something deep inside me. But I also knew that his behavior wasn't entirely his fault. Children learn from the environment they grow up in. If Tom had become callous and indifferent, it was because he had never truly seen the consequences of his actions. And, perhaps, that was where I had failed. I had shielded him from the harder lessons, thinking I could protect him from pain, from the consequences of his own behavior. But now, as I thought about it, I realized that my efforts had been misguided. By constantly excusing his behavior, by always forgiving him without teaching him the true weight of his actions, I had inadvertently allowed him to develop a sense of entitlement, a belief that he could do whatever he wanted without facing consequences. It wasn't just Tom who needed to change. It was the entire dynamic that needed to shift. I couldn't deny the guilt I felt. Part of me wanted to go back, to apologize for leaving, to patch things up and pretend as if nothing had happened. But I knew that if I did that, I would be compromising everything I had just worked so hard to achieve. I would be going back to a place where my feelings didn't matter, where my needs were constantly overlooked. I had to hold firm in my decision, no matter how much it hurt. The family I had known was no longer the one I had left. Things couldn't go back to how they were. Then, a few days later, I received a message. It was from my son. His words were simple, but they carried a weight that I hadn't expected. "Mom, we need to talk. Tom's been asking about you. He feels bad about what happened. We all do." My heart clenched at the thought of Tom feeling bad. Was he really sorry? Or was it just guilt weighing on him? It didn't matter, really. What mattered was that my son had acknowledged the situation. For the first time since I left, someone in the family had realized that something was wrong. It wasn't just a passing moment of childish behavior. It was a sign that something had to change. Maybe it was too late. Maybe the damage had already been done. But there was a glimmer of hope that perhaps, just perhaps, this could lead to a better understanding. I thought long and hard about what to do. Part of me wanted to stay away, to continue living my life apart from them. After all, I had made a clean break, and it felt good to have regained some of my independence. But another part of me wanted to go back. I didn't want to hold on to this bitterness forever. I missed them. I missed Tom's laugh, the way my son would tease me about little things, the sense of belonging that came from being part of a family. But I also knew that going back meant facing the same issues again, issues that had never truly been addressed. After much reflection, I decided to meet with my son. I wasn't sure what would come of it, but I knew that if I didn't try, I would never be able to move forward. I needed closure, not just for me, but for Tom. He needed to understand why I had left, and why I couldn't just forget the hurt he had caused. When I arrived at their house, I felt a wave of emotion wash over me. It wasn't the same place anymore. The familiar comfort had been replaced with an unspoken tension. But as I stepped inside, I saw Tom standing there, his face filled with uncertainty. He looked at me with wide eyes, and for the first time, I saw something I hadn't seen before. Remorse. "I'm sorry, Grandma," he said softly, his voice trembling. "I didn't mean to hurt you. I was just being dumb." His words were simple, but they hit me harder than anything. He wasn't trying to excuse himself. He wasn't laughing or shrugging it off. He had finally understood. And in that moment, I realized that maybe the family could heal after all. But the road would be long. It would take time, trust, and effort from all of us. As I looked at Tom, I knew that I had made the right decision in leaving. But now, maybe it was time to start rebuilding. It wouldn't be easy and it wouldn't be quick, but it was a step in the right direction. We would all need to learn, grow, and change. And perhaps, just perhaps, this could lead to the kind of family I had always hoped for. One where love, respect, and understanding were at the core of everything. A few days had passed since I met with my son and Tom. Their apologies, though heartfelt, had not been enough to erase the pain that still lingered in my heart. The scars, both physical and emotional, had yet to heal. But something had changed. Tom's remorse, though small, had sparked a flicker of hope. Maybe it wasn't too late for our family. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way back. Yet, as the days stretched on, I couldn't shake the feeling that my decision to leave, though necessary, had set something in motion that couldn't be undone. My family was no longer the same, and I wasn't sure if I could fit back into the role I once had. What kind of relationship could we have now? Would I ever be able to forgive the indifference I had felt, or would it linger between us forever? Despite these uncertainties, I knew I couldn't just walk away from them entirely. They were my family, Tom, my son, my daughter-in-law. I had loved them for years. I couldn't abandon them forever, and I certainly couldn't let this moment define the rest of my life. But how could I ever truly return to a place that had felt so unsafe, so dismissive of my feelings? The answer came in a way I never expected. One evening, after a particularly long day of reflection, I received an unexpected call. It was my son. His voice, though strained, was full of sincerity. "Mom, there's something I need to tell you," he began. "It's about the heirloom, the ring." My heart skipped a beat. The ring. The heirloom that I had taken with me when I left. It wasn't just a piece of jewelry, it was a symbol of everything I had held dear. Passed down through generations, it had been a tangible connection to my past, to my parents and my grandparents. It was irreplaceable, not in monetary value, but in emotional significance. When I left, I had taken it with me, not as a punishment, but as a way to make them understand that actions have consequences. I hadn't expected them to even notice its absence, let alone call me about it. But my son's next word surprised me even more. "I know it was wrong of us to dismiss what happened," he continued. "And I know that the ring means a lot to you. But we've realized that it's not about the ring. It's about what we've done, what we've allowed to happen. We want to make it right." I was stunned into silence. This wasn't what I had expected. I thought my decision to leave had been the catalyst for change. But this felt different. My son wasn't just apologizing for the incident with Tom. He was acknowledging the deeper issue, how they had treated me, how they had ignored my worth, how they had failed to see the pain I had been hiding for so long. "I don't know how to fix this, Mom," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "But I want to try. I want to make things right between us. I've spoken to Tom. He's been feeling awful. And we both understand now. We were wrong." There was a long pause, and I could feel the weight of his words pressing down on me. This wasn't the same empty apology I had heard before. This was real. My son was finally seeing the truth, and I knew it. I wasn't sure what had prompted this sudden shift, whether it was the realization of how much they had taken me for granted, or if it was the absence of my presence that had made them realize how much they needed me. But it didn't matter. What mattered was that they were starting to understand, but the surprise didn't end there. "We've put everything together," my son continued, "and we want you to have it back, the ring. But more than that, we want you back, Mom. We need you." I felt a lump form in my throat. The pain of the last few days, the hurt from Tom's actions and my family's indifference, began to melt away, replaced by something I hadn't allowed myself to feel for a long time. Hope. Hope that things could be different. Hope that I could go back to a place where I was valued, where my feelings were acknowledged. "I don't know if I can just walk back into things like nothing happened," I replied softly, my voice thick with emotion. "It's going to take time." "I understand," my son said, his voice steady. "But I want you to know that we're committed to making it right, and we'll do whatever it takes." There was a quiet pause before he spoke again. "We're going to start over, Mom. Together." In that moment, I realized that sometimes healing doesn't happen all at once. It takes time, effort, and a willingness to acknowledge where things went wrong. My family wasn't perfect, and neither was I. But this moment, this willingness to confront our mistakes and rebuild from them, was more than I could have hoped for. I wasn't sure what the future held, but I knew one thing for certain. We had taken the first step toward healing. It wouldn't be easy, and there would be setbacks along the way, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like we could make it through this together. The next few days were filled with long conversations, tears and apologies. Tom, though young, expressed his regret in his own way. It wasn't easy for him to understand everything, but I could see that he was trying. He was learning the hard way that actions have consequences, and that respect isn't something that can be taken for granted. The heirloom ring was returned to me, but it was no longer just a symbol of the past. It had become a symbol of our future, a reminder of the struggles we had faced and the commitment we had made to each other. It wasn't about the ring anymore. It was about the bond we shared and the willingness to rebuild it, no matter how broken it seemed. I didn't know what would come next, but I was ready to face it. Together. The days after I met with my son and Tom felt like a quiet storm, one that wasn't loud or chaotic, but still carried with it the weight of everything that had been unsaid for so long. There was an undeniable shift in the air between us. I could sense it in the way my son looked at me now, in the way Tom's once carefree attitude had softened into something more reflective, more thoughtful. It wasn't perfect, not by any means, but it was a start. It was the beginning of something I hadn't expected to see again, something I wasn't sure I'd ever get back. Still, there were moments of uncertainty. I had left that house with a heart full of hurt. A heart that had been bruised not just by the physical pain of being burned, but by the emotional wounds I had carried for years. How could I ever go back to the way things were? Could I really forgive them for dismissing me, for overlooking the years of care I had given them? I didn't have all the answers, but I knew one thing for sure. I had to try. The phone calls had continued over the past few days, brief but full of sincerity. My son would check in, and sometimes Tom would get on the line too, his voice soft and almost apologetic, as though he were still unsure how to approach me after what had happened. It was strange to hear, to know that the boy who had once made me feel invisible was now trying to connect, trying to make amends. But it was a good kind of strange, uncomfortable, yet necessary, like the growing pains of something new and fragile. I spent a lot of time reflecting on everything. I had been so focused on my own pain, on the hurt they had caused me, that I hadn't considered how this might have affected them. Yes, they had made mistakes. Yes, they had failed to see the gravity of the situation. But in the days following, I began to realize that they too were living with regret. They too were carrying the weight of what had happened, and perhaps in their own way, they were struggling to find a way back from it. I wasn't the only one who had been hurt. I wasn't the only one who had been suffering. One afternoon, after a long day of thought, I received a call from my daughter-in-law. It was unexpected, and for a moment I wasn't sure how to respond. We hadn't spoken much since that day, the day I left, so hearing her voice on the other end of the line felt both foreign and familiar. "I've been thinking a lot about everything," she began, her voice softer than usual. "And I just wanted to say that I'm sorry too. We all should have done more. We should have seen you. Really seen you. And I'm sorry we didn't." Her words were simple, but they carried the weight of a truth I hadn't expected to hear. She wasn't just apologizing for the incident with Tom. She was acknowledging the bigger issue. The way I had been treated for so long. The way I had been invisible in my own family. She was apologizing for the silence that had taken over, for the lack of understanding, for the emotional distance that had slowly but surely crept in between us all. I didn't know what to say at first. I felt a lump in my throat, a mixture of relief and sadness as I listened to her words. I had spent so many years feeling unappreciated, unseen, and suddenly, here she was, acknowledging it, offering an apology for the things that had been left unspoken. It felt like a balm to a wound I had long ignored, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope that things could change. "I didn't want to leave," I said quietly, my voice thick with emotion. "But I couldn't stay in a place where I wasn't respected. I didn't want this to happen, but I didn't know how else to make you understand." "I know," she said softly. "And I'm sorry. We all are. We've been blind, and we didn't realize how much you've been carrying. But we want to do better. We want to make things right, whatever it takes." I could hear the sincerity in her voice, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was being heard. It wasn't just about the hot water that had burned me. It was about everything that had built up over the years, the emotional neglect, the lack of appreciation, the feeling of being taken for granted. It was about the years of my life that I had spent giving and giving, only to be dismissed when I needed support in return. But now, things were changing. Slowly, but surely, my family was starting to see me again, really see me. It was the first step toward healing, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like there was a chance for us to rebuild what had been broken. A few days later, I visited their house again. This time, there was no anger, no distance between us. My son, my daughter-in-law, and even Tom, who had been so distant before, were all waiting for me. Tom stood up when I entered, his face full of sincerity and regret. "I'm sorry, Grandma," he said, his voice quiet but sincere. "I didn't mean to hurt you. I've been thinking a lot about what happened, and I promise I'll do better." I didn't expect him to have all the answers, and I didn't expect him to suddenly become the perfect grandson. But in that moment, I saw something in him, something that had been missing before. He wasn't just apologizing because he had to. He was apologizing because he understood, and that was enough for me. We sat down together, talking, sharing, and beginning to rebuild the trust that had been broken. It wasn't easy, and I knew it wouldn't be fixed overnight, but it was a start, a beginning. The road ahead would be long, but for the first time in weeks, I felt like it was a road worth walking. We had all learned something in those painful days. For me, I had learned to stand up for myself, to set boundaries, and to demand the respect I deserved. For my family, they had learned that love isn't just about giving. It's about seeing, understanding, and valuing the ones who have always been there. And as I looked around at the family I had almost walked away from, I realized that sometimes, in order to heal, you have to face the pain head-on. Only then can you rebuild, not just the relationships, but the bond that truly holds you together.